made it some time.
So besides being a wonderful talk, that may be the only one that actually stuck to the 45 minutes we were requested. Thank you. So,
Can you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So please keep your hands up for a minute. So Ed and
Hey, Steve, so I've always liked this paper, but now there's something that kind of dawned on me. You know, the first quote about space not being a substance, right? I mean, that's the classic line that starts from Patrizzi, right? It says it's not a substance because it doesn't act on things, and it's not a property of bodies because it doesn't flip from one body to another. But isn't that different? I mean, it seems like then you go on to talk about forces in space. Forces in space acting is different than space as a substance acting. I mean, Patrizzi's point, which Newton is getting into, is that it falls outside the Aristotelian categories altogether. And it just seems like a different metaphysical issue than forces in space.
So,
I mean, how would you respond to that?
Yeah. In De Graaf, the way he talks about the activity that one could find within space is by means of forces, by the language of forces. I think at this point, resistance is the only force relevant to him, and of course the inference is immediate. You can only have the force of resistance if there's a thing there, right? He doesn't have a more generalized conception of force at this point. It's an early track. But he thinks if you could think of the criteria of substantiality. You have to reason backwards. You find causal interaction, and from causal interaction, you infer to substance, right? So you first find something that exerts power, force, etc. Then you reason to substance. If you can't find it, there's no substance there. And that's all he's saying. It's not, I'm not sure if that captures your point, but I don't think there's much of a problem.
Well, maybe I'm just thinking is that there's metaphysics 1 of space and metaphysics 2 of space. There's how it fits into a general category of substances and properties in and of itself. And then there's a question of forces in space.
Yeah, and what I'm saying is that those are more connected than I think you're making them seem, because it does not fit into the traditional substance ontology because it is inert, right? Because it is capable of no action. And so finding action present in regions of space is the way to figure out whether it's inert or not. If you could find a region of space where there is no action, then you figured out that Patrizzi's line is empirically verified. Otherwise, it's not.
Robert, is that a finger, George, or is it a hand?
If I could you have your hand up? Or?
There's a cue ahead of you.
No,
if it's
no,
a
no.
finger, okay. Robert?
So first, just a brief historical point. You quoted Catherine's rating as talking about Newton transforming philosophical and metaphysical questions into empirical ones. But you could have given any number of quotes from Howard Stein.
Oh yeah,
or
many.
Catherine's just the latest
Yeah.
one in a long line of people
Absolutely.
following that. The other thing is, I mean, I agree with, I find this really interesting, and I learned a lot from it. And I agree with almost all of it, except it still seems to me that even if you take into account these draft definitions, in spite of his having taken out I don't define, he still doesn't define space. He defines body and vacuum in ways that presuppose that everybody already knows what I mean when I say space. And when he says other sciences, he could be referring to a controversy that was going on at the time about what we mean by the vacuum, right? And there was a sort of technical term that came into the literature, the Boylean vacuum, as a kind of answer to this. Well, the Boylean vacuum is the one in which there's no air pressure, right? And Newton's introducing these, it seems to me, you could say has another kind of obvious purpose, right? He wants to be able to say the sense in which he has the right, in spite of other things he's adding later, right, about the subtle elastic spirit that might be out in space, right? Whatever it is that's causing gravity, he still wants to be able to say, here's my reason for arguing that the planets move through space largely without resistance. Right? And there's no Cartesian vortex out there. There's no room for it. I forget which proposition this is, but I can put a kind of upper bound on the possible density of the medium. That's something I can make into an empirical question. And if in other sciences there are reasons to think there's something there in space, I'm only talking about this.
Okay, so
But the point is, he might have said, I don't define these things, but he still doesn't define them.
Okay, so three things. First about the braiding point. Yeah, absolutely. I think, in fact, the first time I learned of this move was from reading you. So it's just that I picked it because it's very vanilla, actually, in terms of its characterization of that. Second, about not defining. The definition is indeed a vacuum, but I think the inference from what you think the vacuum is to the metaphysical status of space is so immediate, it's the one he used earlier, that it seems entirely unreasonable for me that he wouldn't have made that connection. That is, if he used to think that space is this special kind of ontic entity because there was absolutely no force in it, if now he's willing to say, I'm not sure about that, right? There may be things there of which I do not know of, that destroys that old inference. And I can't see how he wouldn't have made that connection.
But then he might have just been thinking, when he wrote De Graaf, he didn't really have a theory of interplanetary interaction, I think. Back
No,
then,
certainly not.
he might have thought that it's possible that there are things out in space that are the cause of gravity. Like, now he's thinking, if there's something out in space that's the cause of gravity, it's clearly not ponderable matter.
Mhm.
It's got to be something else. And so
Sure.
he's not really talking about the nature of space. I mean, I agree with you that he certainly doesn't have the same view as in De Graaf. I'm just saying, I'm not sure that this change in the third edition suggests a new view of space so much as a new view of what could be there in between two bodies.
Right,
That's
so
a possible
I see the
interpretation.
connection between the last sentence and your penultimate sentence is much closer, I think, than you think it is. That is, that the view of what's out there in space is actually highly connected to what space is, metaphysically speaking, because of these earlier inferences, because that was the way he argued for the metaphysical status of space earlier. Maybe a different way to approach it is to address your third point about the Boylean vacuum. So one way to what? Right, so he actually tells us what the other sciences are in the longer quote. And they are things like vortex theories in general. He at some point entertains like Aristotelian theories and then just shoos them off. One way of reading this is as complete sarcasm. He says, there aren't any other sciences. I don't care. Right? You may worry about this, but you're all being ridiculous if you think that you could come up with something else. I don't think that's the case. Simply because he repeats it over and over, and it's just the way it reads to me, a more serious tone, that he really wants to insulate, to draw boundaries of what he thinks is the acceptable vacuum. But I don't think it follows from that. How should I put this? Right, the question of whether space is truly devoid of all substance is not resolved by measurements of virtually no resistance. Right? The resistance could be vanishingly small and evenly distributed throughout all space. This is exactly what Coates points to him in the two globes experiment. It could be vanishingly small and yet it's just continuously distributed. So the two things don't align. I mean, the measurements just don't guarantee that. It's only on the assumption of atomism, which he has no grounds for other than an assertion, that it follows that in fact there are spaces of truly no resistance. And proposition 6 of book 3, he changes, in fact, the claim that there is a vacuum, which was in E1, to a conditional. If you give me atomism, there is a vacuum. He never asserts that there is a vacuum in the final versions of the Compendia, not categorically, right? It's a conditional. So I think that's significant, because that's precisely the argument that earlier on allows him to say that it has its own status, and he doesn't have that empirical connection anymore.
Kirsten, is that a finger or a hand?
A hand.
Then
We can talk later.
So actually, kick me to the back of the queue.
Okay. Then, who's next?
Thank you. I really loved your talk, Svi, and I'm really looking forward to read the papers.
Thank you.
I just have two questions. So the first one was what you're going to answer to Joe's question of why Newton, kind of relegated some things that he said about space and time in the Demoto drafts to not, deciding not to, the definitions draft, deciding not to include them in the first edition.
Mhm.
But that's an unfair question because, it doesn't pertain to the changes between the first and the third edition. So
Okay.
the more, and the second question is, so is that manuscript seems to say that the definitions for the third edition that Newton intended to put in there are for book 3?
Mhm.
Why do you think he has a set of definitions in book 1 and then, he adds something in book 3?
Because these are, so second question first, because these are physical concepts. Right? They're not, book 1 is mathematics, right? And with the exception of maybe definition 3, the definitions are mathematical quantities, right? It's the quantity of motive force, it's the quantity of, the absolute quantity of force, it's the quantity of matter, right? They're mathematical properties of things. Here he's defining what the thing is, right? What is the body that I'm talking about in this treatise? What is the space that I think this body is traveling through? There are others, they're not this, they're not physically loaded. Part of this is phenomena, he defines explicitly what he means by phenomena there. It connects to these. There's another one which it escapes me now. But basically they're here because they're relevant for book 3. They're not relevant for books 1 and 2. Now your first question about the, what was it? The Demotu sequence, right? That might be more difficult to answer quickly, but I think that actually the story that, George's talk yesterday about Newton coming to realize the concept of a natural power, I think is important because in the course of the Demotu drafts, Newton comes to see that he's moved beyond a mathematical exercise to some deep investigation of nature, right? And I think him taking out the definitions of absolute space coincides with that development. That is, he does want to bring them into the fold of natural law. I've discovered something real here. There is a thing called absolute space. Right? I don't need it as an explanatory mechanism, but it's out there. I figured it out. It has to be there given, all the other things I know. And so he, according to this story, has a reason why he doesn't want to bring them into the axiomatic deductive system. He's not thinking he's treating that stuff in the manner of geometry. He's revealing what space really is. So I think that's kind of a gesture towards why they may go in and then go out.
George?
First, tell everybody, page 357, if memory serves me right, is the second page of book 3, with the opening page being that explanation about I had.
Yes, that's right. This is after the rules.
Oh, it's actually after? No,
Or
no,
maybe
there are no
before the
rules. There's hypotheses.
No.
That 357 is first edition number.
No, I think that's second edition number.
Are these definitions for the third edition?
Yes,
Not
these
the- oh, my
are for the
mistake.
third edition, yeah.
Okay, well then, what I was going to say about destitutor is irrelevant.
Okay.
I was going to talk about first to second edition.
Maybe it's relevant
No,
anyway.
no, I think it,
I could call it up, but if I remember correctly, it's, there's the heading of book 3, line 3 is where it says rules, and he wants to insert them right
I just
before the rules.
misunderstood.
Okay.
And since I was the referee for the paper, I'm really embarrassed.
The other half of the paper.
Kirsten?
Yeah, so this is very half-baked, but I think there might be an
That
interesting...
fits well with the paper.
I think there might be an interesting parallel with how Newton's going about defining things like vacuum and how he decides that light is a substance in the first optical paper. So here what he's sort of doing is he's like, okay, we all have this, this concept of a vacuum or this concept of space is kind of quite well known to everyone. And here he's just kind of going, and whatever everyone thinks that means, that's the concept here too. And so he's just kind of going, okay, so whatever you mean by space, this thing is space in that sense, like it's empty. But then, and so in the first optical paper, he kind of does something similar where he says, okay, you know, the passage where he says, you know, it can no longer be disputed that light is a substance. And he says, well, because substances are things that we see because, you know, they've got color. Well, you know, it turns out that light has the color. Light is the thing that kind of, you know, causes us to have that sensation. Therefore, we have to call it substance. Because whatever concept we already have of substance is a thing that supports properties or something. Light has that too. So I'm just kind of noticing there's kind of an interesting parallel. And so I'm wondering if this is kind of going further through his work than just him sort of starting to do this with the Principia.
So, so that he uses a similar criteria for substance in the 70s makes perfect sense. And so what we do know about de Graaf is that it's written somewhere between 68 and 84, then people argue. But that's the same time frame, so it's not surprising that he uses the same one. But just a note about how to read de Graaf and how to read his discussion of what I claim is sort of the thing out there, the thing in itself. It's not as if he's saying we all know what we're talking about, end of discussion. Rather, we all have some set of ideas about space. I'm not gonna, we kind of know what they are. Let me now, as other natural philosophers have done, as Descartes has done, as Patrizzi has done, tell you which part of these make sense, which part of these are inconsistent, which part of these get ruled out, and he wants to rule out lots of Cartesian theses about space. But he wants to say that that's what space really is, right? So that's what I mean. When he says I don't define him, it's not because there's agreement and we all know what we're talking about, right? There's just a shared set of some ideas about space, right? He doesn't need to do them, he doesn't need to explain them further than that. But I think that's the less important feature. The reason he doesn't define them is because definition in these contexts means something different to him. It means defining in the manner of geometers, which means removing it from its natural philosophical context and embedding it in a framework that allows for mathematical treatment. And my claim is, yet again, is that he doesn't think he's doing that initially, that he's treating it in scholia in the freer kind of discussion because it's the natural philosophical object out there in the world in itself.
Right.
So George, that's a finger?
Well, I want to go back now to this definition.
No,
What I was
please.
going to say before, but it's pertinent here. There's a complex history of the subject of resistance in space in Newton. Leaving aside what he says in the scholium to the augmented version of De Motu, where he talks about the ether being almost nil or indistinguishable. In the first edition of the Principia, he used pendulum decay experiments in an effort to demonstrate that resistance to a body moving through air or water or mercury, since he did all three kinds of experiments, is proportional to the density of the medium. And those experiments did not succeed in establishing that. So when you read the conclusion of section 7 of book 2, it is relatively weak. And it definitely does not make the claim that there's resistance is definitely proportional to the density of the fluid. Nevertheless, when he gets to the whichever corollary it is of proposition 40 in book 3 on comets, he uses this word, it only occurs once in the first edition, destitutuntur, which is a very striking word. When I noticed it, I opened the concordance to see immediately, and it occurs exactly twice, once in the first edition, and then in the second edition, in the conclusion to section 7, after he has the vertical fall experiments and has extremely strong evidence that resistance is proportional to density. Now he says it there. Space is destitute, devoid of any form of resistance. And the comet, he had already said that for the comets, but he didn't have real evidence for it before. Now, what's going to happen here is Coates, defending him, has a very, very strong rhetorical paragraph in which he says, okay, so what the vortex people are saying is the density is very low. In fact, the density seems to be 0. And if the density is 0, there's no matter there, and therefore it's a vacuum. And if you look at that, it's one of the strongest rhetorical passages in the whole of the preface. And this could be nothing more than backing off that strong rhetoric of Coates, because all he needs is what that first sentence says.
Right. Yeah, agreed. And you think this would, even if this is just backing off Coates, the idea that now he can't guarantee that there's nothing out there.
Well, he has reasons from the optics also to be very worried about ether being out there.
Mm-hmm.
So I would connect it to that. I know Rob Iliff would too.
Okay.
That that's flirting. He goes back and forth on whether there's ether there or not.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, in the 1717 edition of the optics, he brings the ether back in where it's not in the queries in the earlier. So all I'm trying to do is put that sentence in a historical context.
Mm-hmm. Good.
Because I think there's a rich historical context.
Right, and there's also a Leibnizian context that I haven't discussed at all, and that's sort of what McGuire focuses on, is Leibniz, Clark, and some of the other letters for where this becomes necessary. But it's great that there's another context, in fact, because all these various usages point to exactly the same kind of problem, which is
I agree.
the metaphysical theses before do not align squarely with the physics of now. What do we do? That's the dilemma. Yeah.
Elliot, we are now back to what was the end of the queue when you requested you be moved back.
Okay, so we've just talked a couple times, so I feel less uncomfortable stopping there. So reading these two definitions now, they remind me of how body at least is defined in distinction from space and de Graaf, and it's striking how before, like that's couched in the language of impenetrability, right? And so like if there's a region of space that, partially, right, but
So the definition of body in de Graaf is that which fills space. Then later we find out that it has some other properties, but the definition of body is not at all like this, right? That is the, I mean, I know you've read the paper that focuses on, that focuses on this, but everything can be moved or touched. That's it. That's the criteria. I mean, you could infer now that it fills space, but that's not what he's saying. De Graaf is about filling space.
right, but so these seem linked though, at least in the de Graaf, right? If you're going to say that that by virtue in which something can be moved or touched, like that comes through. I would suppose I guess it does just start with impenetrability in the creation story. And then he adds the capacity to affect minds, so maybe it is just impenetrability doing that. Okay, but, so I'm thinking about Rockstock and how, so the concept of inertia is changing from de Graaf throughout the De Motus through to the Principia. And I'm wondering if that, and so that was argued to affect Newton's notion of space, right? And so I'm wondering here if a similar thing is happening with this shift in how inertia is viewed and how bodies are conceived. And so like with this disappearance of impenetrability and things now being talked about in terms of resistance. So I don't know what the definition of space is in the whichever De Motu. Was that right? There's one De Motu.
In yielding medium.
Okay, so.
It's not a definition of space. It's a
Absolute
definition
space.
of absolute space.
Of absolute space.
Versus relative space.
Okay. So do you happen to know where, like, what happened to impenetrability and why resistance is now playing this role, and if resistance was part of inertia, right? If that somehow is changing throughout these times.
Does this notion of resistance have anything to do with inertia?
Yeah, it is. That's all it is. And there is no remainder, right? That's what he wants to say here. It's the stuff that has inertia, basically. When impenetrability disappears, that's a much more difficult question. I don't know if I could put a finger on that. In fact, it's not clear that it really disappears from his manner of thinking about bodies till later, and that's the paper that I know you've read. So there's an argument to be made that he really doesn't kind of excise the, what we call the geometrical conception of matter, that he excises that from his mind until much later. This is debatable, but they certainly coexist for a while, and then by this point I think it's very clear that the extended conception of matter goes away. What he needs is inertia, and he needs nothing else, and does not want to comment on anything else associated with matter.
Robert, you got a quick finger?
Yeah, just to say, I think that Eliot's right, that this is much more similar to what he says in De Graaf when he talks about how a body fills space, what God would have to do to space to make it full of body for us, and the differences can be entirely accounted for by what George said, that now he's concerned about defending the view that the space is empty of ponderable matter, and to defend something else he adds in the third edition, that discussion with General Scolian, that gravity is a sufficient cause for everything and acts alone, essentially.
Yeah, I don't see how that obviates or how that removes the idea that once having gotten to this position, the earlier metaphysics gets immediately thrown into doubt. That it is impossible that he would have thought at this point, I still have empirical grounds for my old metaphysics as I thought I did when I wrote De Graaf. Regardless of what gets him here, and if that's all we're sort of going back and forth on, that's fine. Once he's here, it's clear that that old argument no longer works. And so at one point he thinks he has direct empirical evidence for a metaphysical view. It's not merely that he turned a metaphysical question into an empirical one. They completely align. Later on, they no longer align. He had a metaphysical view. Now the empirical evidence it doesn't support it. So the question is, what cognitive attitude, what epistemic attitude are we to take towards this metaphysical view? If you go with sort of like a Geniac interpretation, you say, well, these are just the divine metaphysics. He believes in this independently of anything else, right? You could go, say that. What I'm suggesting is that he only gets to that point after realizing that the empirical evidence won't do it. That is, in De Graaf, you don't need to ascribe a divine metaphysics to him. He has empirical evidence. He has an empiricist metaphysics in De Graaf. Later on, the metaphysics of space that we traditionally ascribe to him, the metaphysics of De Graaf, is no longer connected to empirical evidence. If there's any purchase to divine metaphysics, it's only later. And it only comes about because he's struggling with these concepts. He's struggling with how to find whether there are truly empty spaces or not.
Is this a finger or a hand?
It's a hand.
Okay. Then Greg?
This is a pretty mundane question.
Not divine?
No, yeah, not divine. When you showed the definitions for book 3, they were crossed out. So I wonder if you could just fill in for everyone who's not a manuscript maven, what happened then to those definitions?
I don't count as a manuscript maven in this room. They were just scratched out, and that's the last we've heard of them. So now an interesting question is, why don't they make it into the last
Yeah,
edition?
so that's...
Okay. This is obviously just brute speculation, but I think the cascading changes are just far too vast for him to have included it. There's a Leibnizian context now. This basically says, hey Leibniz, you may have a point, right? There may be stuff out there. He certainly doesn't want to do that, right? Other reasons might be just more kind of cheap, right? I mean, he's not dealing with Coates now, he's dealing with Pemberton, he's getting up there in age.
79.
79.
My age.
Young man. Young man. Be careful.
Thank you, Isaac.
Yes. But unlike you, George, he died shortly thereafter.
We're talking 1721 if it was printed in 1723. So.
No, it wasn't printed, it went to the
Went to
printers.
the print. That's the
in
point. but
1723.
I'm using 1721. as a
Okay,
guidance,
okay.
definitely.
And I think the list of changes would have cascaded too far, right? What I've sort of tried to suggest is that these bring in certain concepts into the manner of geometers, precisely what he doesn't want to admit to Leibniz, right? They're talking about the things out there in the world, which is the true position in natural philosophy. This is exactly what he doesn't want to do. And I think so it's external pressures that make him not want to full-throatedly say this. But that's pure speculation.
Sure. We have 3 minutes.
So very short version of this. So you start off, there's the quote from Stein about the asymmetry between his the status of bodies and the status of space.
Mm-hmm.
So as of 1716, your position is there's no more asymmetry. They have essentially the same status.
That's right.
Okay.
That's it.
And the last question.
All right, I'll make this quick, though this would have been the first question that I wanted. There was something that was puzzling, and now I can point my finger at it. So it seems like the metaphysics and whatever empirical or arguments Newton had for it, in your view, are kind of clearly, like nicely laid out. So in the
graph.
In the graph, you seem to have that, oh, here's the metaphysics and some arguments or some clear empirical bearings that would happen that metaphysics. And what's the story that you have to tell for the Principia? So are those definitions in the book one the true mathematical part of the metaphysics or not? If they're not, then why would just the scholium be metaphysical if there is? And then where would those definitions, these definitions that he wanted to include it in the third edition, be on the metaphysical plane, right? So if they're in the manner of geometers and they're used for axiomatic, would you take them to be kind of,
I think this removes
ontologically
them,
loaded?
start at the end. I think this removes them from the metaphysical plane. Right? This means I'm dealing with this as a geometer, with all the attendant assumptions of that. Now, what of the definitions in the Scholium space and time? That's a super interesting question. I think the Scholium on space and time is still in the Scholium structure. He still takes himself to be talking about metaphysical truth there. And I think one of the issues, one of the also problems with making these explicit is that it's even hard for us to think of what he might think of absolute space if it turned out to, if it wasn't non-substantival, right? How could he even think about that? It seems it took us 200 years to figure out a weaker geometrical structure. He doesn't have all the language necessary to say, I no longer believe, I have no evidence of its ontic status. Maybe it's a substance, maybe it's not. However, it has these geometrical properties, but what has these geometrical properties? I mean, he doesn't have a language by which to express this, right? So I think that's what I meant by the cascading changes to admitting this are just too vast, right? They ask him to come up with these sort of weird ideas, which I think he is sort of like hinting at. He sees something there. Right? He doesn't need absolute space for physical explanation. It is slightly different than other people have used absolute space, or that he used absolute space earlier on in his life. But
He never did before, and neither did anyone else.
well, space in general. Sorry, I shouldn't have said absolute space, right? But Patrizzi and friends talk about the same sort of space, the infinite, immobile, indiscernible, all these properties that he claims in De Graaf. So I think saying that no one else talked about that kind of space is going too far, right? They didn't call it absolute space, but there were precedents. But then what to think about it? It's a thing with a geometrical structure that he needs, that he knows he needs. I think the general line of reading that from the laws of nature and what you need to make sense of mechanics is entirely correct. But what is the thing that has this? He no longer has any answer to this. Before he said, well, it's an affection, or maybe as it were an emanation, and I have reasons for thinking why it's that. He no longer has a way to answer that question. Right? He can't definitively say it's an emanation because of these reasons. If it's a substance, then that opens up all sorts of other metaphysical questions to ask of it. So there's just no good answer.
Okay, so we've already gone a few minutes over, and we're getting really late.